Okay, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off and get us started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Corn and Cover Crops Strategies for Success. My name is Erin Gundy. I am a soil health educator with the Soil Health Institute. I would like to quickly introduce my colleagues, Anne Marie Calabro, who's also with SHI, and Olivia Cayuette at the University of Missouri Center for Regenerative Agriculture. We three support the education component of Farmers for Soil Health with our different organizations. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide farmers, crop advisors, conservation professionals, and others interested with information related to integrating cover crops into the corn year of their crop rotation. Today's webinar is supported by Farmers for Soil Health, or FSH. The initiative is one of many USDA-funded Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities projects. FSH is a collaborative initiative of commodity organizations, the United Soybean Board, the National Corn Growers Association, and the National Pork Board, with the goal to increase cover crop adoption. This specific project provides incentives to farmers who are new to planting cover crops or who have been planting cover crops for many years, as well as offering a sustainability marketplace to connect the farmer to the supply chain. State-level commodity organizations working across 20 states stretching from North Dakota to the East Coast are involved with FSH to provide local technical assistance and outreach programming. FSH has also developed a website full of resources and information to be helpful to anyone working with farmers, or if you are a farmer or a landowner. You can learn more about FSH at farmersforsoilhealth.com. Enrollment for 2024 fall planted cover crops is open now through February 2025, so keep an eye out for that. Lastly, a few items about today's event. The presentation is being recorded and an email will be sent next week with a link to the recording and how you can find it on the YouTube channel, along with a final feedback survey. To kick things off, we'll be working with the webinar series today in 4 sections relating to cover crops ahead of planting corn. First, we're going to start off with covering species selection, then establishment, then termination, and then corn planting. Frank will talk about his expertise, experience, and advice, followed by time for Q&A for each section. We will also have time at the end for general Q&A. So if any questions come up, you can put them in the Q&A for each section, and then we can also cover some things at the end. You can upvote questions that you'd like to prioritize that we cover live. If you'd like captions on, those can be enabled by clicking the 3 dots on your toolbar and navigating to captions, and be sure to hang on to the end for information related to the one Certified Crop Advisor continuing education unit for attending this webinar. With that being said, I'm excited to introduce our guest, Frank. I'll let Frank introduce himself and take it away from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin. So like Erin said, my name is Frank Rademacher, and I just appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all today. I farm in Champaign County, Illinois, which is in East Central Illinois, and I also serve as the conservation agronomist for the Nature Conservancy in Illinois, where I primarily work with farmers and advisors on local water quality issues. So again, it's a pleasure to be here today. So on our farm, we've been no-till and cover crop ahead of corn and beans, depending on the field, for like 5 to 10 years now. And so we've really tried to push the envelope. We've had that flexibility. Dad and I both have off-farm jobs, so it's just worked out well. And we had kind of a unconventional path back to the farm. So really didn't have a lot of those practice history ties that people do that grow up and kind of transition directly to the farm. So yeah, no, it's great to be able to talk about this. We've made a lot of mistakes and learned a lot along the way. And those of you that have messed around with cover crops before corn will understand when I say, like, Erin and I go way back, and I thought that we were friends until she asked me to talk about this topic today. And so I'm going to do my best because there's a lot of nuance to it. And, you know, I'll give you a primer for each section, but really I find, especially with this topic, more than any other soil health topic, that a lot of it really comes down to the questions. So please do put those questions in chat. And if we don't have time to get to them all, always available after this kind of thing to handle those. So I think if you look back at any presentations I've ever given, and I encourage you not to, basically there you can tell a pretty long story of like every year it's like this is what we're doing now, and this is why, and this is going to work, and we're really excited. We found the system that's going to be it. And then the next year, I give another presentation that's completely different, why last year didn't work, and why now what we're doing now is the best thing. So I think that this will likely be another in a long line of what we're doing now and why it seems like the best thing we've ever done. And it may be, but it may not be the final thing that we ever do. So again, this, I have to just stress that this, especially when dealing with corn, is really a production system. And so, things break down, things don't act like how you think you would. So understanding this is a production system, not just how to plant a cover crop before corn, is really, really important. So just wanted to talk about what we've tried that doesn't work for us in the past, our system, just a real quick overview. We really went all in. We have a crimper on the planter with the intent of reducing weed pressure and reducing our nitrogen all in one. That was kind of our goal, was to plant green into a big cover crop ahead of corn. And so, yeah, we learned a lot. We were doing early maturity crops. We were drilling a rye and vetch mix. And we would wait till like late May and crimp that and plant green. At the time, we had a completely surface band nitrogen program, so about 100 pounds on with the planter as UAN with a stabilizer and some sulfur, and then 60 pounds of nitrogen Y drop later in the season. Again, trying to get that nitrogen both early in the season and then as close to the plant as possible in a high residue no-till system. So had a lot of success and challenges with that, and so we've tried to adapt. So kind of where we're at now, a little bit more context. So we've moved to a 20-inch corn spacing. We are on 20-inch corn and beans now rather than 30-inch as is standard for most folks. We are all on non-GMO corn and have been for several years. We are back to just regular maturities. We do actually plant seed without an insecticide on it, only using fungicide seed treatments. So we are completely insecticide free in a no-till and cover crop system using non-GMO corn. We've actually moved, and this is a hot topic in soil health, we've moved back to anhydrous ammonia in the fall. So we are putting about 2/3 of our program on, about 120 pounds in the fall with a stabilizer into living cover crops. So again, we feel just research-wise with the stabilizer in the cover crops, there is a pretty good indication that we're not losing any of that. We're planting into 20 pounds of barley, 20 pounds of wheat, and then 3 pounds of camelina as our cover crop, which we aim to terminate about 10 to 14 days prior to planting our corn. We'll terminate that with Roundup and 2,4-D, and then our post program, as appropriate, last year was a split applied Acuron program, but we may switch that up. And then with the planter, we're applying 5 gallons of 10-34-0 in furrow and 60 pounds of nitrogen banded still. And that is that's the end of our nitrogen program. So today, like Aaron said, we thought it'd be helpful to talk about this in a chronological manner. So kind of our first section here, we're going to talk about species selection. And really what I stress to everybody is, it seems maybe not related, but I think the strongest thing that you can do to build a great program is to have a well-defined goal. So whether that is nitrogen production, erosion control, weed control, whatever the deal is, that really, really defines your success and what species you're going to ultimately use, because a lot of your goals are really based on the carbon and nitrogen ratio of that final mix. So again, have a really well-defined goal. That's where I feel a lot of people fail, is they don't even go into it with well-defined goals of what they're trying to accomplish. I think point number 2 that I would stress is just to expect the unexpected. It's really fun when you're making a cover crop mix, and then you assume that it will grow in the ratio in which you plant it. And I've never found that ever to happen. So I think it's great. This is why they tell you in soil health to have a lot of backup plans. So I usually figure on like 3 general plans. 1, if everything goes as I hoped. 1, if you're doing a really complex mix. 1, say if grasses take over, what do you do then? Or what if like legumes take over? How does that complicate your planting depending on their growth growth form. So those are the things to be thinking about is a backup plan if you end up with a very different mix than the one that you planted, as does happen. So then just when you're thinking about what species to plant, I think it's sometimes easier to start with your goal and then say what species don't work and just go from it the reverse direction. So really, what is my goal? What species and what mix will help me get there? How are those species going to play into my conditions? So the growing season length, if I need a lot of growth out of that species, am I going to have the time to get that growth? What's the herbicide plan going to be? What is my planter setup, right? Can I plant into, say this does turn into a fully grown cover crop? Can I even plant into it? So really, there's a lot of nuance to an individual operation. Also be thinking about how you're going to plant that species and if it's incompatible with any other species. So my example here would be like really large species that may want to be planted deep, something like a winter pea, compared to something like a brassica, like a camelina or rapeseed, which really wants to be shallow. So how do you plan to apply those is critically important. And then termination, when am I planting that? What's the crop or what's the nutrient uptake of that cover crop? Obviously, the grasses take up so much nitrogen. So how is that timing going to play with when my crop needs nutrients? And just general management timings. People like to use things like annual ryegrass. That has a very specific termination window that you need to really understand in a mix. So really, the more advanced the goal, I do want to stress that when you're starting out, maybe it makes sense to use like VNS, variety not stated species, but really as your goals get more complex, really spend a little extra money and pick a species that you are going to know the qualities of, when it's going to mature, how it overwinters compared to other named varieties, that kind of thing. And then just to close out this section, just I think some specific species breaking down by grasses, brassicas, and legumes. Grasses, we've tried rye for years and years and years, and we've tried different rates, we've tried different mixes. I never really feel at this point that rye is a great option, especially if you are going to be planting green. I think it just grows way too fast, takes up way too much nitrogen. But that said, there are people that do it successfully, but for beginners, certainly not. I think there's really much better options. That's why we're with wheat. Wheat is really hardy due to a little bit more plant breeding. So I know it's going to overwinter really well, not like rye is an issue there. But also it grows rather slow and it's short, right? So it's a little easier to manage your management window if you're going to terminate early is a lot more flexible. And barley is a great choice as well, although it does mature rather quickly. Brassicas are kind of a fun one to include. So we've had a struggle with rapeseed. We do tend to drill all of our cover crops. Rapeseed, I think, is for our location is hard to get in early enough. So we've had some overwintering issues. So we've kind of moved to winter camelina, which is kind of newer on the scene, but really works better in a later planted scenario for sure. Very similar to like you would find with like a rye. And then lastly, legumes. By risk level is kind of how I wanted to talk about this. So that risk level is maybe how fast they grow, what that growth looks like. Is it a vine? Is it hard to plant into? Is it going to stop row cleaners? That's kind of how I went about thinking about this. So crimson clover is a great, easy one to start off with, not horribly expensive. As legumes go, a decent sized seed. And upright growth. So it's not gonna give you a whole lot of problems. Like I said, named varieties, Kentucky Pride, I think is a newer one that has hugely improved overwintering ability compared to some of the classic varieties. Peas are nice. Sometimes they don't overwinter well. They like to be planted really deep. They are viney. Be careful of that. But they seem relatively wimpy, like they would break apart relatively easy with a planter. Next one that's really popular in these circles is Balanza. So Balanza clover, I will say it's a good option, sometimes hard to get established, incredibly small seed, but it can be a really aggressive grower. And there's some trials that if they get in late, have had serious corn issues because the biomass is so hard to plant into, it gets so thick. So watch out for that one. And then hairy vetch, something we used for years. Great seed size that's compatible with a lot of grasses, kind of a similar seed size, but it's hard seeded, so you will see it in later years. We haven't planted it in a couple years, and I still find it just about everywhere. Crimps decently well, depending on the actual variety. It is similar to rye, so it can work really good in that mix. But it is often pretty slow to get growing, and it's got very strong vines that have and will stop a row cleaner dead. So things to watch out there for sure. Um, but yeah, that's all I've got for corn and cover crop species selection. Um, did you want to stop and take some questions, Aaron?
Yeah, we don't have any questions coming into the Q&A yet, but I wrote down some questions. Um, I would love to know, you spoke about how it's important to know what your goal is ahead of selecting species before corn. So I was wondering, when you and your dad first started, what was that first goal and how has that goal changed over time, right? Because now you may have a different goal for your cover crops ahead of corn.
Yeah, absolutely. We when we started, I mean, like I said, now we're drilling. We had gone to things like hairy vetch, trying to replace nitrogen. Really, when we started, like years one through three, four, Dad was just flying on cover crops just to learn the system, just wanted a living root, and we were killing it early, real basic mixes. And then we kind of evolved to wanting um, more weed control and to replace some nitrogen. So that's why we moved to a bigger mix that we would crimp. And now I think and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but consistency is what we're going for. Some of those mixes can be inconsistent. So now we need a consistency across the board. We need to know what that cover crop is going to do now. So we're back to more like living root, low disturbance, but also not really complicating our corn management program on top of it.
Awesome, thanks.
Mhm.
Um, Olivia, do you mind unmuting? It looks like we have, I think there was somebody that raised their hand. Maybe it went away. Just kidding. Okay, you're probably monitoring that. My next question was kind of still a little bit more general, and then we'll jump into we're getting a few in the Q&A and what's your number one recommended mix or species for a beginner? And this may not be somebody new to cover crops, but just new to the cover crops ahead of corn game. You hear a lot, especially in the Midwest and the I-states, folks recommending an oats and radish mix because you can kind of get the fibrous root with the tap root and mix those together, and then you're in a winter hardy situation. You don't have to worry about killing it off before planting your corn. Thoughts on that, or what have you had experience with that you would probably recommend instead, if there is anything that you would recommend instead?
Yeah. I I'm always split on oats and radishes. I think it's nice to really slowly get somebody involved just so they can see some green out there. But I think as far as like any kind of a measurable benefit, especially at the cost, that usually runs a pretty high cost program. I really struggle with that. I think you're better off picking a couple of species. Say for like somebody getting started, plan on terminating early, 10 to 14 days ahead of planting your cash crop, and likely stick with wheat or barley as two really good options that will grow. I think wheat is probably overlooked. It's going to grow slow, not very aggressive. It's going to not take up a ton of nitrogen like rye will. And then whether you're getting that on a little earlier or later, I think that's where you make that camelina versus like rapeseed question. If you're going to be terminating early, I don't see, unfortunately, a lot of value in legumes just given their cost as well. I don't think there's going to be a benefit there. So grass in Nebraska is typically what I tell people.
Awesome, thank you. Um, we're gonna save a couple of the questions that are in the Q&A for establishment because I think that that goes, it's talking about nitrogen and other fertilizer. So I'm gonna skip down to a question. With equip requiring two species, what do you recommend for a mix for easiest termination with a goal to build organic matter in a clayey side hill situation?
We've got what I would call some clayside hills. And if anybody has the answer, please please tell me. Um, I think I would stick with the same answer. Like I think so we've got areas of fields that I swear to you will not even grow a cover crop, and we've tried a lot of different species. I think when you get into those really difficult spotty areas, that's where there's a little bit more value in saying, okay, we're going to do not just wheat, we're going to do wheat and barley, and we're going to do, maybe a little bit of brassica or a little bit of a couple brassica species, maybe throwing out some legumes, which may actually grow better there. I think if you're looking at that's what we've noticed. There's very little minor species to species variation that one species may work really well in those areas and another may not. So that's where I would go to if you're going to really want to build organic matter, you really need time. And that's an unfortunate hard complication is like you need a longer growing season and push that cover crop growth out.
And be aggressive in the other crop years too, right? Like in your soybean,
Yes.
you're really focused on biomass and getting a really fibrous root, right? So maybe you're not going to build much organic matter ahead of the corn year just because of some other limitations, but you could be a little bit more aggressive ahead of some other crops.
Yeah, and that's what soybeans are really good for. Really, really good for is that rye before it.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we haven't gotten any other questions related to species selection, so I think we can feel safe to jump over to establishment if we want to jump into that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I did see one from Brian real quick that I'll hit, just pounds per acre. So right now we're on 20 pounds wheat, 20 pounds barley, and then 3 pounds of camelina. We're still playing with that ratio a little bit, we are using a low disturbance anhydrous rig. That's really pretty, it's more of like a disc in season machine. So we do have some losses, and that's kind of what we're figuring out is kind of playing with that ratio a little bit more. So that's kind of where we're at. Okay, so yeah, moving on to establishment. And again, I appreciate those questions. Um, so this is a rather short section. I'm not going to really beleaguer the point of like, here's why you would fly on versus like I think there's um, a lot of materials out there already on those points of different options. I can tell you what I like and don't like, but I think the biggest thing that I cannot stress enough is really aiming for consistency, and don't think of that consistency in just getting the cover crop consistent. Think about that starting at harvest of the previous crop. So when you're harvesting your soybeans, say you're in a corn soy rotation or whatever's before your corn, making sure that you are spreading that residue evenly is, I think, what I would place as really goal number one in making, because your seed bed prep, especially in a no till or low till system, really starts with harvest of the previous crop. And so a lot of times we're seeing that combines are getting a lot bigger, and so bean heads are getting a lot bigger and a lot of times bigger than they can effectively spread. And so we see a lot of streakiness in a lot of fields, really due to those bean heads taking a larger swath than the combine can spread evenly. So that's where it starts for us. That's why we've moved away from flying on cover crops, is because of that consistency issue, and why we're at drilling, and why I promote things like that and broadcast or header attachments instead, because you will see that in the maturity of your next crop, right? Come tassel time and your field looks like this tasseling. That's oftentimes why, as you can tie that back to inconsistent residue. So, your soil warms up faster, better temperature, better emergence, is certainly something to think about that some people miss. But pre-harvest, if you want to do something pre-harvest, really aerial is your option. And that's hit or miss, right? That's a great way to what do they call it? Mow the yard with your combine, right? End up like if you're doing oats and radishes, get into a wet fall and suddenly your radishes are half the height of your soybeans, like those kinds of things happen. So I will say when we've tried aerial and then the same year's done some drilling, we've actually had the drilling catch up to in maturity the cover crop that we planted even a couple weeks earlier with a plane. So yes, it feels like you're losing time, but if you can gain consistency and good seed placement, and overall healthy stand, especially for more advanced cover crop goals, that's something that I think is really worth considering. Another thing that I think is overlooked, just one application method that I think is important that people maybe don't talk about near as much is things attached to your header. There's some folks that have that locally and really have done the math. It's a little complicated as far as filling, and it doesn't feel like you want to stop the combine, but minutes per acre is really what your overall establishment is for those cover crops. So that I think that's a good low cost strategy for sure. But the one thing that I did want to mention just in establishment. And I would like to point people to, actually, we just did a webinar, like I think on Wednesday, that I was a part of that. Dr. Allison Robertson out of Iowa State did some really good work on corn seedling diseases when planting a corn crop into a grass cover crop. I would encourage people to look at that. I think what your trade-off really is here, and I've talked about early termination. I think the research that she's done really shows that to reduce seedling diseases, which can be incredible when planting green, you really want to separate your cash crops and cover crops either by time, so that's that early termination, or by space. So planting, say, 10 to 15 inches away from your cover crop row with some kind of precision. So I think a lot of people should look into maybe even using like a 15-inch planter or something to really do precision planting of cover crops to get them off of their corn row. And I think we've struggled with that for years. But yeah, I would point, maybe we can share that resource with people later that they can check out. So, but in terms of establishment, unless there's specific questions on actual methods, that's about all I've got.
Awesome. Thanks, Frank. Looks like we have a question from Anna, looking for best practices for getting covers established late in the fall in a zone 4 to 5.
Okay, let me really quickly Google what zone 5 is. Um, I should know that too. That's
Oh,
embarrassing.
she's in Maine. There you go.
Okay,
Thanks,
yeah,
Anna.
yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, I think. Oh, let me check another resource here. Aaron, do you know if the Midwest Cover Crop Council tool has information for Maine? Their row crop tool.
They have a counterpart in the Northeast. It's the Northeast Cover Crop Council. Olivia, can you drop that in the chat, that link to that?
Sure can.
Yeah, that's what I would encourage folks to use, and that's what I use locally. And that also, at least in Illinois, I know there's some variation from state to state, but I know that's a lot of times what NRCS defers to for programs is the recommendations in some of those resources. Yeah, if you pull that up, and assuming it's anything like it works in the Midwest Cover Crop Council, if you put in your county and your goals, it's actually great. Like it really lines up well with my whole presentation, which is nice. But like if you put in your goals in county, at least in Illinois, the version will tell you like a county level recommended date. And so for something late, I think you're going to want to check and see what species line up with what you're trying to do. Depending on the species, that's where that nuance is. Rye is always safe. Rye can grow from Canada down to, I don't know how south it goes, but I think in that kind of scenario, rye could make sense if you're going to terminate early. And then it's, of course, very friendly to any kind of application method. Wheat also is pretty hardy. And I think that's probably where you would want to stick if you didn't want to do rye, was a wheat cover crop. And I think camelina, again, I sound like a broken record, but there's not that many great options before corn. I think wheat is a good base of a mix. And then if you are going to do one at a legume, ugh, some vetches are built for that. You need to know how to plant into that. Or maybe a crimson clover if they go that north, but I'm not sure that they do. That's where the nuance of the tool comes in, is for recommendations like that.
Yeah, definitely. And then we had a question. I think this question was more so involved with corn planting. So we can also address it when you talk about planting your corn.
Mhm.
But please restate your nitrogen product and amount applied on the planter. I assume that they're talking more for the corn planting, but we can talk about it once again here. I know that you've stated that a couple times.
Yeah, no, and I'll hit it again too. Yeah, so just let's see. I'll just talk about real quick what we did. So we were, like I said, 100 pounds at planting, and then 60 pounds like wide drop, trying to get it as close to the plant, line up with the timing that the plant needs it, but trying to push that a little earlier, that ratio of application, just because with nitrogen tie-up, like we wanted it there when slightly before the plant needed it, because we did have a bit of a deficit. We'd never felt like that we could get enough nitrogen to that plant early enough in that framework. So that's really why we moved to fall anhydrous. But would do spring and high anhydrous too, depending. But into cover crops, that was a little risky. So now we're at 120 pounds of N with fall anhydrous with stabilizer into that grass mix, and then 60 pounds of nitrogen and sulfur on with the planter as UAN.
Looks like that person said thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Matt. All right, I think we can jump to our next section, termination.
Termination. Yeah, so that's another short section. Like I said, species selection is really the biggest thing, because it really colors how you do all of these preceding topics. So I'll do a little bit on products and maybe a little bit more on timing. So for termination, really the standard that we stick with and don't really vary from is Roundup 2,4-D mix. Um, I mean, there's people trying to get around, especially in the soil health community, a lot of people trying to get away from Roundup and replace it with more of like a grass killer herbicide, like your group ones, your select, fusillades, assures. I've heard it done successfully. I've heard it done unsuccessfully. It's really hard, I think, to get that kind of consistency. Roundup just works so well for cover crop termination. So Roundup, a little bit of 2,4-D to clean up, especially if you're going to have legumes in the mix. Really recommend some like a synthetic auxin, a group 4, like a 2,4-D, dicamba if you're brave, that kind of thing. Just because there's a lot of clovers that really take to Roundup really well. Um, and so they'll hang on pretty good if you're just using Roundup. So 2,4-D is a little safer, especially if your cover crop is inconsistent and you've got some winter weeds like a mare's tail, or horseweed, depending on where you're at coming up. That's I think just a nice standard mix. So when we're doing early termination, we have not been putting a residual in with that. We will just follow that up with some kind of a post application, and I'll talk about that in a second. So yeah, like I said, selective grass killers can work, but not something I typically recommend for people. But the one big exception, I think this works really good in a corn system. There's a lot of folks I'm hearing more often now where they're planting a grass and legume mix. Um, and if things are going right or wrong, there's a use case for a grass killer sometimes where people are like, all right, I've gotten really good ground cover out of my grass mix. And now it's April. I'd like to just spray out the grasses and let the legumes grow for a little while longer till I'm ready to plant. So you're reducing that seedling diseases, but you're also building some actual potential for nitrogen, and probably a much safer mix. Again, actually, that Iowa State research had been done on hairy vetch, and yeah, very, very much lower risk to seedling diseases when planting into a legume. So really killing out those grasses early, and planting into legumes green is a really, I think, good option. But I've also heard it as kind of a rescue treatment, like, oh shoot, like I said in the beginning, I didn't have much grasses in the mix, but now they're kind of taking over, and that's not what I was hoping for. So killing them out early or weakening that stand another good strategy for an actual just grass killer. Again, timing, I used to be what I would call like a purist on this and like, no, we're all for soil health and we need to plant all this green. And that's the only strategy to maximize our benefits. But that may not be the strategy to maximize your corn. So we're trying to find that middle ground here where still get the benefits through good nutrient management and cover crop use and tillage, where we feel like we're still getting really good outcomes by killing that cover crop a little bit early. If you are planting green, again, just your motto should be to kill that before it's like say 14 inches tall at the max. Please don't kill things much bigger than that because they will fall over and stay wet forever. And so I hear horror stories every year of like, well, I killed it at 20 inches because they told me I could, and then it stayed wet till August, so I went in with a disc. And please don't do any of that stuff. If it's shin height, kill it. If it's above that, congratulations, you get to plant green. So call somebody for help. So yeah, but again, like I said, your goals at the beginning, if you want nitrogen, if that's what your goal is, then you're planting green. You're waiting a month later than everybody else is planting around you, and you're planting green into legume mix, and it's really, really challenging because the consistency is a struggle. And we did have, I will say, when we were planting vetch, you would stand in something that you couldn't even walk through. Just incredible. Couldn't see the ground, 6 foot tall, climbed up all the rye. I don't think we would need any nitrogen there at all. And then you'd walk 50 feet to the west and it would just all be rye. And there's a few rye or a few vetch plants here and there. So it's really hard to get a consistent good stand to reduce nitrogen. That's where we run into. So like I said, just in summary, we're not using any residuals for early termination. Just the Roundup 2,4-D. Last year we used like Acuron, which is an herbicide mix that has like a split application option where you can do like a half pass at planting and then a half pass a couple weeks later. That I think worked pretty well. But there are other options there. We may mix that up a little bit. But I think what we really settled on when we were doing like late planting, what I would recommend for people is plant your corn. If you are planting green, use that Roundup 2,4-D option and kill it. And then if you've got a good stand, for years we tried to put in a residual at the time just to be safe. But if you've got a good stand, I don't think that ever really worked for us. I don't think that got any benefit out of that residual. I think you're better off just scouting early and often and counting on that cover crop for a couple weeks of residual. And I think you'll likely get it and then use an early post pass, because weed science would tell you you want that corn to be weed free between like emergence and V6. So if you can keep clean in that period, which should be possible, that would be the strategy. But happy to take any scenario questions now.
Thanks, Frank. We don't have any questions coming in the Q&A quite yet, so I'll encourage folks to drop those in. We can do an awkward pause here for a few seconds. And if we don't get any questions,
Holy cow.
we can save that one for the end. That one's
Yeah,
a general species question. We'll save that one for the end.
that's an interesting one because as you saw, I'm in Illinois. Like I couldn't tell you where the nearest cow is. Let me I will let me read that and think about that real quick.
Yeah, you can ponder on it as you talk.
Yeah. Yeah, and I may need a little bit of clarification on that one, but that's a good question. Something they turn the cattle out on. Okay. Yeah, okay. Great. Let's do the next section. Think about that more and we can get back to that. And the next one's pretty quick as well. So
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think again, we are no-till. I think we're looking at, and it's complicated because we're in 20 inches, but as far as corn planting for that section, if you can switch that slide.
Yep. Here we go.
Let's see. I mean, what I tell people, we are 20 inch. which really complicates any kind of a tillage system because yeah, it just gets any amount of strip tillage on 20 inches is basically full width tillage. Like it's not too far off. So if people are getting started, I tell people go strip till. I think that's just a fantastic method. And there's ways to do it low cost. People doing it with just anhydrous rigs. If you're on 30 inches, that can work in the fall. Like really good strategies there. But tying back to that IO research, like if that's not an option for you, coming up with what they call biostrip till and really precision planting of that cover crop offset of your rows. I think those are really the two best options. And we've tried to do that by moving drill row units around over the years, but it is a tricky thing to do with a drill. So that's what I encourage people to do. Really making sure that you've got a consistent strip or at least consistent conditions across the field if you are no-till. So again, that goes back to your residue spreading, to your cover crop mix and that consistency. All of those things are really important because you will really see that in emergence and it will really, really struggle. As far as planter setup, that's one where just your basic no-till planter and upkeep sounds obvious, but I think it's something that needs mentioned. So yeah, build that consistency. Clean strip through like row cleaners. Shark tooth row cleaners are often a really good option. So floating, I really like just to keep from digging and kind of help those follow the ground. There's really good options now. Making sure your gauge wheels are properly set. This sounds insane, but when I've helped people locally like do a little bit more no-till, they're like, "Wow, this is crazy. I've never changed disc openers." Like, wow, that's terrifying. Like, so you know, it is a different school of thought that you need to be aware of. Good closing system, really important. There is a lot of local variability on this, and so it's hard for me to really speak to some of your situations. I think just talk to people locally who are doing it successful because no one size fits all. We're using spiked row cleaners, which really helps us. But some people somehow get along planting green with just your stock smooth opener or closers, which is just incredible to me. But in some soils, it works. And yeah, just knowing your cover crop mix, again, things like vetch, vining species will stop row cleaners, and it's a mess. So know what you're planting into. And then lastly, just to talk about nitrogen overall, really nitrogen timing and amount and placement are really your big considerations here. And it depends on again your individual practices, but you really want to make sure that that young corn plant is never looking for nitrogen. And so in my opinion, I'm saying you want about half of your nitrogen program available at planting. I think that's a good starting point. And really, I want to stress also that covers ahead of corn, when you do it right, doesn't necessarily change the amount of nitrogen, but really the timing and the placement. So, yeah, just front loading that nitrogen is really important. So, like I said, we're doing 2/3 fall anhydrous, which we think research based into a cover and stabilizer is really good. And also, honestly, I'm getting older. Like it was really hard to put down 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, like keeping up with dad, you know, with as UAN. Like that's a really challenging thing. So like this just helps us scale a little bit better. And yeah, lastly, I would point you to your university nitrogen recommendations. We're sticking with the University of Illinois. 180 pounds MRTN rate is kind of where our state works out to our region. So again, not necessarily added nitrogen, but more just a different timing on that. And with that, I can handle, let's see if I can go back to that question. So let's see. So,
The second question from Rod, he was kind of
okay.
explaining what their experience is, and um, his question down at the end is, have you ever harvested camelina? Do you have any experience
Mm,
with camelina? Because he kind of explained that they have a strip till twin row, and they do oats and a legume mix ahead of corn after their soybeans. But they're looking at using camelina for jet fuel.
yeah. The only one locally that we hear of is pennycress, which is another brassica. through a company I think called Covercress. We don't have any experience with it here. I would be curious of the timing. A lot of like Covercress, what they promote is that you can double crop soybean, or you can full season crop soybeans after it. But it does lead to some complications. It really depends what your local pricing is. I haven't been um, too convinced by their pricing, especially when I'm trying to do our spraying, our planting, and then to get the combine ready at the same time. Um, and harvest while I'm planting cash crops, harvest another crop. Like it's a really tight timing on some of those brassicas. Another thing to just watch out for is like harvestability really hard. I mean, camelina, it's like 500,000 seeds per pound, really tiny stuff. And so making sure you're set up to um, mid to late June harvest, okay, is what they're saying. Um, yeah, so probably closer to like a double crop bean. Yeah, it depends on the economics, and I can't really speak to what they are for camelina. I think those markets are coming, so I think it's really good to take a look at them. But yeah, it can be complicated. It can be really hard. As somebody who's done wheat or had done wheat for a couple of years, that timing was kind of nice because you did at least have some breaks between cropping seasons. But yeah, it can be tight, so it's hard. Crop diversity is hard. Let me maybe read that question. So somebody starting to get into cover crops, do you have a species suggestions for cattle and row crop operation in Iowa that started planting silage corn back to back in the past couple of years that also turned their cattle out on corn stalk fields over the winter? Is rye the best one to plant, or is there something else that would be good to add? As not a grazing person, and I cannot stress that enough. The one that we hear about locally, that may be a better fit in that scenario is something called triticale or triticale, depending on how you pronounce it. It's got the overwintering potential of rye. I believe it's actually a rye and wheat hybrid. And I think what it's known for is when rye really starts to lose, um, when rye really loses its quality as it really grows. Trit really keeps that quality for grazing and I believe baling. So yeah, that's I think that's the limit of my knowledge, unfortunately, on grazing. But I'm sure Aaron can point you to some really good grazing resources.
I was going to say, Olivia has already dropped one from the Practical Farmers of Iowa, so that would be in your home state. Um, for the person that asked that question, PFI has, yeah, they have really awesome resources. You can also look into the Wallace Center has a program called the Pasture Project, and they have all kinds of resources and a really awesome way to kind of collaborate and network too with folks in the grazing world, especially grazing cover crops. So really supportive organization there as well for grazing cover crops and incorporating grazing cover crops with a regenerative grazing intensive rotation situation as well. So really good mixture of resources going on there. But I think the only thing else that I'll comment on that topic is, you know, if you're looking at just sticking to the normal um, corn year, that's one thing, and following Frank's advice, I think is a good route to go, but can consider, switching up your years a little bit and trying to plant, maybe skipping a year or planting wheat and then jumping into, being able to plant a summer cover crop is where a lot of folks have a lot of benefit with getting a little bit of extra grazing. And you can do a nice sorghum Sudan grass mix with a whole bunch of different species that flower at different times to get a really nice, healthy summer cover crop mix. Folks have a lot of economic benefit, it seems like, from doing something like that. And it also switches up your crop rotation, which may be of benefit, but it may be a little bit difficult if you're looking at relying on that silage. So it just kind of depends, which way you're going to go.
Yeah, and I think just to add real quick, I know we're kind of coming up on time here, but again, I know so little about grazing. I should know more, but I think that maybe is an option too, where some people will you're taking it off early enough that like an oat and radish as part of a mix, like so to have that fast growth and then the more overwintering growth of something like a triticale in there as well is another strategy. So like given the really good strategy about that is like it does give you so much more growing time. So yeah, there's a lot of really good creative options for grazing and good economics behind it.
All right. Well, I'll give a couple more seconds if anybody has any last minute questions for Frank.
Yeah, just a comment that the expected camelina yield there is 1 to 2,000 pounds with the price contracted 88% of soybean Chicago. Very interesting.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
and lastly, you can say you can share my contact information, so I'm always happy to answer questions after this. Okay.
oh, we do have, oh, nope, it got taken down. I was gonna say someone raised their hand, but they took it away. All righty. Oh,
I think, yeah, Kat's hand keeps coming up and down. See if I can unmute you. There you
Hello?
you there. There you go.
Oh, awesome. Hello there. Good morning. I'm in Birmingham, Alabama. I used to live in Peoria, Illinois. Can you hear me okay?
It's a little fuzzy, but we can hear you.
Okay. Let me take this mask off. Whew, it's hot out here. Anyway, so I grew up in Peoria and raised a lot of corn, decalcified corn, know everything about corn, have 40 years of growing. So I moved down here to Birmingham for longer growing season. And I want to be the master corn grower down here. I don't know what's going on. This soil is not, well, I don't know if it's the soil or the insects, but it will not really do well in Birmingham. We have clay soil, we have a lot of loam soil. So should I do a cover crop, a winter blanket, and then try and pursue it? Any suggestions?
Aaron, did you catch the end of that question? Can you repeat that?
Any
Yeah, can you
suggestions?
repeat the end of your question? You said, can you, would you recommend planting a cover crop ahead of that corn? But then you said something else.
Oh, a winter blanket, we have a lot of clay soil, a lot of red clay, and some areas are sandy, loomy soil. So not having much success with corn in Alabama.
Gotcha.
You know,
Yeah, I think organic matter may be a hindrance. So I think Frank, you can kind of speak on how to build kind of that.
yeah, I think it really depends what your limiting factor is. I know a lot of clay soils can have like compaction issues. And so that would be something that where a taproot makes sense, and that's going to come from a lot of your brassicas. You do have a wildly different growing season than I'm used to. Yeah, I think it's going to be a combination again of some kind of a brassica, and then you want the biomass of a grass. Depending on your crop rotation, that's going to really depend, what you can plant. Unfortunately, I don't want to offer too many examples or scenarios that you should or too many recommendations for Alabama. Unfortunately, that's a little bit outside of my. But I always say find somebody locally who's doing it successful, and I think there's a lot of like
Yeah,
good.
I'm sorry, they're asking me. They're like, "You're from Illinois. You should know this."
Well, yeah, I think everything works in Illinois.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Thank you,
So
Kat.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hopefully I can get
All righty. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in to our Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and, oh, we have one more question. Is there any data on the impact of cover crops terminated 2 seasons before planting corn? I feel the time to decompose and release back to the scavenged nutrient will be a little longer than what we allow in our current termination program. That's a great question. I've also seen some research on that too, of how a year ahead, is what we should really be looking at as far as decomposition time. Do you have any notes to say on that before we close things out, Frank?
Yeah, just real quick. I know that there's been some local studies on, testing the soil nitrogen and how much is in the plant. And I think with the intent of like figuring out, okay, when does that give it back to the soil? When is that available? And there's some really good researchers in Illinois who are like, they don't know where it's going. And so that's really complicated. I will say that the bigger your cover crop, the more you're going to run into that. When we were like crimping rye ahead of soybeans, and we would have, say, like a lot of biomass and then like a really dry summer where we're not getting great bean growth, not getting great breakdown, we would definitely see that in the corn the following year. So yeah, it does happen, and I don't think it's really even clear yet when that nutrient is given back to that system. So it's a lot sooner with a legume. Grasses, it could be a while, if at all.
Yep, ever evolving research. Alrighty. Well, in the sake of time, I'm going to start closing us out. So I appreciate you all tuning in today. It's been a wonderful discussion, and we appreciate Frank's time to join us. If you would like to hear more from Frank, check out his podcast episode on soil sense to learn more about what's going on his farm. A lot of that he covered today is similar to what he says on the podcast, and also the work that he does as conservation agronomist with TNC. A short Zoom survey will pop up once this webinar concludes and you close out. We would greatly appreciate if you could provide us with your feedback. And we do have 2 upcoming webinars in September. That information will be in the follow-up email, as well as Olivia is going to drop some links into the chat, or Anne-Marie as well is going to drop some links into the chat so that you can register for those. Really great topics coming up that we're looking forward to offering. And then we do have 1 CECA CEU credit for this webinar, and you can request that by scanning the QR code. So I'll leave this up for just a second, but you can also email me with your information, and I can get that all submitted for you if you do that by Monday. So I'm just going to give that a hot second, so that way folks can scan the screen real quick. Okay. And then feel free to contact us. We can also, yep, Anne-Marie dropped Frank's email into the chat, so feel free to reach out to Frank at his TNC email, but then also you can reach out to myself, Anne-Marie, or Olivia, and then check out Farmers for Soil Health. We have a clearinghouse of a lot of resources that you may find useful that we covered on today's webinar. And with that, keep a lookout in your email next week for the webinar recording, another reminder for the survey, and some information about upcoming webinars. If you have any other questions, reach out, and otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Frank.